costly to animals. For example, places to breed, breeding habitat could be limited for animals, or there may be patches of good habitat that are separated by large stretches of unsuitable habitat that's dangerous to cross. So rather than leave home and try to find a territory that maybe doesn't exist, it may be better to postpone dispersal, postpone leaving home, wait until conditions improve and to stay home. It also can be beneficial for animals to try to settle permanently near their place where they're born and to breed there. And we call that natal philopatry. And in mammals, at least, females have a tendency to be the ones that stay closer to home, whereas it's the males that then tend to move greater distances away from home. And there's some advantages to staying close to home. For example, you know where the escape routes are, you know where the burrows are, you know where the really good patches of food are. Close to home probably has the resources that you need to be able to raise your own offspring because you managed to survive there and to reproduce there. So those two processes, delayed dispersal and natal philopatry, can create populations of related individuals or groups of kin. And once relatives start to live near each other, they can get benefits by cooperating with each other, by helping each other, because they share copies of their genes. So we would expect to see over time more tolerance and less aggression among relatives. Let's see here. We may see then further development of cooperation among kin, where a group of related animals defend a territory against another group of animals. They may warn each other of predators by giving calls, alarm calls. And eventually we may see the development of cooperative breeding, where animals actually forego their own reproduction and instead help their kin to reproduce, their mothers, their sisters, to bring off their own offspring. Now, having said that, it's kind of appropriate with the Thanksgiving Day holidays upon us that we know that kin groups aren't always necessarily harmonious groups of cooperative individuals. And that may be something to think about as you come up against the holidays here. Kin may compete with each other for access to food, for access to mates, and so they may behave aggressively towards each other. We may see cases where parents will prevent their offspring from reproducing, may suppress reproduction in their offspring, or dominant individuals in the population may suppress subordinates and keep them from reproducing. But despite those cases, kinship probably plays a pretty large role in the evolution of mammalian social groups. We know that there are lots of studies that show that females tend to live near each other or with each other. Aggression is relatively mild or rare in family groups. But the thing about many of these studies is that they already are looking at social groups, animal or social species, species that already live in groups. And we've paid less attention to animals that are solitary. And that can be for good reason, because solitary animals are going to be a lot harder to study. But it's these solitary species that can tell us about the early stages in the evolution of social behavior and sociality. The social species can't tell us that because they've already moved beyond that point. So one of the species of animals that we know quite a lot about in terms of their sociality is the marmots. These are basically big squirrels. Marmots are in the squirrel family, so they're related to the gray squirrels and red squirrels and chipmunks that we have around here. It's just that they're ground-dwelling squirrels, so they're related to prairie dogs and ground squirrels that you would see out west. And the thing about marmots is there's 14 species of them, but they have a continuum of social organization. Most of them wait until they're somewhere between 1 and 3 years old before they leave home, if they ever leave home. Depending on the species, for example, in yellow-bellied marmots, the yearlings, so males disperse when they're 1 year old. Some of the females disperse, and so you wind up with a group of kin and a single male. Other species of marmots, like the Olympic marmot, the males disperse when they're 2 years old, and so you get these clusters of kin with satellite males hanging around. And then we also see highly social species of marmots in Europe, the alpine marmot, where you get these groups of these big family groups where you've got the two parents and their 3-year-old, their 2-year-old, their 1-year-old, and their juvenile offspring all living in the same territory and defending that territory against other groups. At the far end of that continuum, we have solitary species, which are the marmots, which are the woodchucks. So woodchucks belong to a highly social group, yet they themselves are not very social. And one of the ways to think about the evolution of sociality in this group and in other mammals is a series of steps. So recall that in most mammals, it's the females that tend to stay home. They're the ones that are philopatric. And then that can lead to the formation of kin clusters. And because of shared genes, we'd expect kin to be friendlier towards each other, have these amicable interactions, to be more tolerant of each other, to eventually then defend territories against other groups, to warn each other of predators, and ultimately perhaps to help their kin reproduce instead of themselves reproducing. So with that background in mind, I chose to study woodchucks for several reasons. For one, they're a solitary species, so they can give us some insights into the early stages of the development of social behavior, as opposed to the more social species that already live in groups. And we really don't know that much, or we didn't know that much, about the factors that affect their social organization. And then from a logistical standpoint, importantly, they are common in the area. They're diurnal, they're active during their day, they're pretty large, so they're easy to see, more or less. And they don't hold any special protected status, so you don't have to get special permits and things like that in order to study them. So since 1998, I've been studying a population of woodchucks that's located at Gilsland Farm in Falmouth. And many of you probably are familiar with Gilsland Farm. It's operated by Maine Audubon Society. And at this site, the woodchucks emerge from hibernation typically in late February to early March. It's when we first see the adults. And it's the adults that come out first. Males emerge first, and then the females come out a couple weeks later. So the males are establishing their territories and they're moving around looking for females. As soon as the females come up, it's breeding season. So the males are courting, they're breeding. Females give birth about 4 weeks later. So it's pretty fast because they're rodents after all. And then, so the pups at this site are born in mid to late April. And then the pups emerge. So here's a pup down here. Pups emerge when they're about 4 weeks old. About late May, early June, okay, depending on the season. And then everybody spends the rest of their time getting fat, okay? Basically doubling their weight over the summer, which is pretty impressive when you start to think about it. When they come out of hibernation, and by the time they go back into hibernation in late September or mid-September for the adults, they, like I said, have doubled their weight. One of the other cool things about the population at Gilsland Farm is that we have some Black individuals in the population, or melanistic. Here are a couple of examples of that. Melanism is not that uncommon in rodents, but it is prevalent. It occurs in this population, which makes things somewhat easier. Okay, now, because I study behavior, I need to be able to recognize the individuals. And if you've looked at woodchucks for very long, you know that they don't really have too many unique markings. One woodchuck pretty much looks like another woodchuck, unless they're Black, but even then you gotta be able to tell the Black ones apart. And so we have to give them some unique markings. And in order to do that, we have to catch them. So what I use along with my students, we use tomahawk live traps, large tomahawk live traps. We surround a burrow with traps, okay, to improve our odds, and then we set up these wooden fences between the opening that's there. One of the hardest things to get for students to learn initially is to build solid fences, because woodchucks will test these and push through them if they're not sturdy. The other thing you have to do is, because many burrows have more than one opening, we have to unblock off all the other openings so they can't just walk out of another opening. So eventually, oh, and I bake them with peanut butter and apples. I think every rodent's favorite food, it seems, is peanut butter, and that seems to be pretty effective. Okay, so then after we catch them, we encourage them to, let's see here, just do this. Okay, here we go. So now I'm gonna transition to the props. So after we catch, so first, my props, this is why we're using the room here. All right, so tomahawk log trap. Pretend there's peanut butter and apples in here, okay? Set these up, okay? And then unfortunately, it's, you know, it's November, although sometimes we don't feel like it. So we do not have any live animals to bring to the presentation. So we have the stand-in for today, okay? So we have my little woodchuck puppet here. So this works pretty well. Okay, so woodchuck puppet goes into, or woodchuck goes into the trap, steps on the back pan here. Sorry, does this work fine? Yeah, there we go. Okay, closes the door. Okay, so now it's secure in the trap. Then we use a special handling bag that I cannot take credit for. It's squirrel biologists worldwide use these to handle animals. So this is just a cloth bag, but notice the shape, okay? It's got a big end, okay, and it's got its little end. And so we just put the big end around the end of the trap, like so. And I reach in, open the door, and convince the woodchuck now to leave the trap and run into the bag. It's not that hard. Well, it depends on the animal. Sometimes it's easier than others. They don't like to be blown on, go figure. So some puffs of air, and eventually they run into the trap. So we shall get the puppet to operate like so. But the nice thing about the trap, but the bag, right, is that everybody's safe. I'm safe. Okay, the woodchuck is always confined. So runs into the bag. Then I use the high-tech shoelace. Tie off the end so they can't run out the back. So there we go. Everybody's, now it's stuffed down in the narrow end of the bag, you can see here. Okay, and now we can do things to it safely. Okay, so one of the first things I do, actually, as part of some research that I'm not going to talk about so much tonight, is I record what I call an index of docility. So for 30 seconds, I record how much time this animal moves around in the bag, how many seconds that is. And there's quite a wide range of variations. Sometimes they just sit there and they don't move at all. Other times they're moving around a lot, trying to get out. I repeat that 4 times and then I take an average. Okay, then I also suspend them in the air for 1 minute and basically do the inverse of that. I record how much time they're not moving. Again, it's a way to measure docility, and then I can correlate docility with some other measures of behavior as well. Okay, so after that, then I just use a spring scale. Talk to the camera here, and I weigh them. Okay, in the bag. Okay, get a weight. Okay, and then when we're all done, I'll subtract the weight of the bag and find out what their total weight is. Okay. And now this is where this clever design really comes in handy. So you can probably see, okay, there's some white here, and this is a strip of Velcro. Okay, so I only need to open up the part of the bag at the animal's end that I want to get to. Okay, so here I can just open up the very back, which I think you can see that. And so the first thing I'll do is I'll sex it to see if it's a male or female. If it's somebody I've caught before, I just look under the tail. You sex it the same way you would a dog or a cat. Look at the distance between the anus and the general opening. Okay, so I just figure that out. Then I put on some gloves and I pull some hair for DNA analysis, because that's one of the ways that we look at kinship, is by doing some DNA work. Okay, then the next part is I have to give it that mark, okay, so that I can recognize who it is, okay, from a distance. And if we were in person, I'd be able to say, what would I use to mark them with? So I can still say, what would I use to mark them with? Well, they're mammals. Any guesses? You can come off mute for a second.
Ear tags. Ear
Ear
tags. Like
tags?
color. Yep.
That is a good one. Although ear tags are little, and I'm not going to be able to see that from a distance. So
Spray paint. Spray paint.
Spray paint, you're getting warm. Paint might be a little toxic, so I need to use something that's not toxic.
Shave a patch.
Yeah, that might not be so fun in the winter time, but that's a good idea too.
Hair dye?
What?
Hair dye?
All
Hair
right,
coloring?
bingo. Hair dye.
That
Yes.
is very funny. Great job,
Yeah,
Emily.
yes, you know, people at Walmart give me funny looks when I come in and buy, 5 boxes of black hair dye. But remember I said, so it's just black hair dye, you can see that. But remember, some of my woodchucks are black. So what color am I going to use?
They're going blonde.
Yes. It's funny, little kids will sometimes say gray, and I have to explain that no, there's no such thing as gray hair dye. That sort of defeats the purpose. But yeah, we just use blonde. Okay, so I mix that up, okay, and I apply the hair dye with a little artist paintbrush. So now I'm just working at the back end here, only the back of the bag's open, and I paint a dye mark on them. They don't like this part very much. Go figure, somebody's messing around their hind end, it probably smells, it's a little damp, but I put some unique mark on the animal, okay, so that I can tell them who they are from a distance. Every animal gets a different mark, okay. Then I close up this part of the bag, okay? And then the last thing I have to do, as somebody mentioned, so one of the problem is woodchucks, like all mammals, molt, okay, they're gonna shed their fur. They molt once a year in the summertime. So they're gonna lose that dye mark. So I need to have a way that I can tell who they are if I catch them again. And that is where the ear tags come into play. And you can't really see these because you're far, far away, or I'm far, far away. But this is a little numbered, it's a little metal ear tag. It's got a number stamped on it, a 3-digit number. Okay, and so now I'm at the front. This is the most dangerous part of the whole process. For 2 reasons. Well, it's the most tense part. For one thing, I'm moving up to where the teeth are, okay? And so I want this animal to keep its head in the bag. So I just open up the part of the bag where I can get to the ear, right here, there's the ear, okay? But this is critical. These ear tags are the only thing that I can really use to tell me that this animal is the same animal I've caught before. So usually really careful there, but I just use a special pair of pliers. Okay, you stick this in. A special pair of pliers, and essentially I just pierce the animal's ear. This is the pliers work to where they crimps over the edge. There's a little hole in the tag, and I put the same number in each ear, one in each ear, just in case they lose one, which does happen occasionally. I still have another mark.
Do the females have one color and then the males a different color? Like is one red, one green, or?
No, the tags are all the same color.
Wouldn't it be helpful to have? Wouldn't it be helpful to have one like blue for boys and pink for girls? I mean, no.
Yes, unfortunately, they don't make the tags in different colors. There was one year where I did put on. They have like little plastic washers that I could put over the tag. A little. It had like I said, it looked like a washer. And I found that the animals ripped them out really easily. I don't know if their claws caught in those washers, but there was a high loss of tags. So I had to abandon that approach. So yeah, so basically I just rely on the dye marks to help me to figure out who's who too. So then all I do is I take them back to the place where I caught them in that same burrow, and I open up the bag. Okay, and then they can just run out down into the hole and go on to live their lives. And I can now, we can watch them. Now, okay, let me go back to here. I'm going to share my screen again. And I'll show you a couple pictures. Let's see. Oops. Okay, so here's what some of the dye marks look like. This is what the blonde hair dye turns their hair red, more reddish. So anybody guess what that dye is supposed to be? What that mark is supposed to be? That's actually an easy one. This is the other hard thing that the students have
Yes.
to learn.
Number
That's an
5.
S. That's an
S.
S. This is Swarthmore, okay? And this one might be a little harder. That's a T.
T.
That's a T, yes. So you can see that sometimes, so when they're in the bag, sometimes it's a little hard to tell how they're oriented. So this is a T. These are both males by chance in my pictures here, but this is T, this is Tulane. And yeah, so he's had a burrow, this, they had a truck here. So there's what the dye marks look like. And then this is what the ear tags look like in this little pup here. So they get their nice little trip to the stylist here. They get their hair dye and their ear tags, they get their earrings. And then we just spend a lot of time watching these animals to get data on where they live and what they do. So to look at space use, we record their locations and we use GIS software to calculate their home range sizes and how much overlap there is. Like I said, we use DNA to look at kinship as well as using direct interactions to figure out who's related. And then to learn about activity and interactions, we record their behavior for 15-minute samples every 24 hours or however often we actually see the animals. And we use our binoculars and spotting scopes for that so we don't get too close to the animals. That's why those dye marks can be so important. So what have we learned after all this time about their behavior? Well, much to the dismay, perhaps, of some parents in the room right now, we've learned that some woodchucks never leave home. Okay, I've caught now over 350, 379 juveniles in the almost 25 years. And about half of them stay home that first year. They don't leave the territory where they were born. And of those that stay home that first year, about half of the females settle in that range or right next door to it. Excuse me, and they become resident and breed in the population. But about a quarter of the males do the same thing. And that was what was somewhat unexpected. The first surprising thing we learned was that many more males actually stay in their natal range or nearby and become resident in the population. That was contrary to kind of the conventional wisdom in the literature, is that A, that they stay home at all, and B, that so many males stayed home. So if we go back to our model here, we see that woodchucks do fit that first stage. We do see natal phylopatry among females. So what are some of the patterns of space use then that we see? So to illustrate these patterns, I'm going to show you an example of one matriline or one lineage of woodchucks. So each of these dots is one location, okay? And this is in the course of one field season. And each animal has its own color. So all of these red dots, and this shade is one animal. This purple is a different animal, each with its location. And so the mother here, or the matriarch, we'll say, is in gray right here. And she actually moved over to the barn and the gardens this year. So and then she comes back over here to hibernate. Okay, so that's the mom. Okay. Her sons are in blue. There's 2 sons here, different shades of blue. And her daughters are in red. There's 4 daughters here, and they're of different ages, various ages, but there's actually 4 sets of daughters that are represented in this picture. In addition to that, the green are her granddaughters, and there's 4 granddaughters spread out in green here and in various locations over here. In addition, 3 grandsons that are in shades of purple. And all of those granddaughters and grandsons were yearlings in this particular year. So what I hope you can see from this illustration is that woodchucks live near each other in this population. They are settling near kin. And that's true not only for the females like we'd expect to see, but also for the males. Males are living near their female kin and near their male kin. So why? Why should they settle near kin? Well, there are costs and there are benefits of staying home versus leaving home. And one of the things to think about is where this population is located and the fact that they may have limited opportunities to leave. So the circle here is Gilsland Farm. Okay, this is the Presumpscot River estuary. Okay, which is pretty much inaccessible for them. Woodchucks swim, they can swim, but they probably don't swim that far, okay? This is Route 1, okay, which is also a dangerous part of their habitat. And then we've got, so if they did manage to get across Route 1 safely, their population here, or this site, is surrounded by subdivisions. There's a golf course up here, okay? So kind of inhospitable or habitat. Many of the people that live around there probably would not really take kindly to woodchucks moving in. And indeed, of the animals that I know have left, and then I know their fates, 2/3 of them have died very quickly as a result of being killed by people, killed by dogs, or killed by cars. Okay? So it's risky to leave home. In addition, this is a pretty nice place to live. There's probably sufficient amounts of food there, so maybe there's not much competition for that food. So the costs of leaving home may exceed the costs of staying home. And as I mentioned before, there are benefits to staying in a place that you know is familiar. So animals are probably trying to stay home if they can, okay, unless they're getting chased out by other animals in the population. So at least in this group, in this population, we see that natal phylopatry amongst females and in some males lead to the formation of kin clusters, okay? Probably as a result of, because basically Gilsland is an island of habitat in a sea of inhospitable habitat. So what about the next step in our sequence, in our pathway here? So this is what some of the DNA stuff work has shown me. So in this graph here, what you're looking at is basically a measure of kinship. So positive values over here indicate that animals are more closely related than we'd expect by chance. Negative are less closely related than we'd expect. And these are the interaction rates for what we call amicable interactions, so friendly interactions. Greetings, sniffing, play, those kinds of things. And what we see is that animals that are more closely related to each other engage in higher rates of interaction, of amicable interactions. Okay? But those interactions vary with age. Okay? So if we look a little bit more closely at the types of interactions we see, so if we just look at mother-offspring interactions, and we look at the rates of interactions when she's interacting with her juvenile offspring, which are in green here, or dark bars, her yearling offspring, which are red, and her adult offspring, which are in blue, we see that the nature of those interactions changes quite a lot. So when her offspring are young or they're juveniles, there's friendly interactions between them, play, greeting, things like that. But once those kids start to get a little bit older, when they become yearlings and adults, that relationship changes and she's much more agonistic towards her offspring. Okay, so agonistic, so those are displacements, chases, even fights. Most of the aggression you'll see is non-physical, so those are displacing them from a spot, displacing them from food, maybe chasing them away. But we do see some fights and bites and things like that amongst those. So as her offspring grow up and now become potential competitors for herself and for her younger offspring, that relationship shifts. Okay. So we do see, for the most part, though, that there are more amicable interactions among kin. There's more tolerance among kin. Although, like I said, some of those interactions between moms and daughters can change and not always are quite so amicable. So they've made it to this third step and then they stop. So woodchucks, at least in the populations that have been studied, don't show cooperative defense of territories. They don't, one group of animals doesn't defend a territory against another group of animals. They do, however, give alarm calls. So they warn each other that there's a predator around. And this is, you may have heard this is what it sounds like. I'll play that again. Okay. That's one of the reasons why one of the common names for groundhogs or woodchucks is also whistle pig. In some parts of the South, you'll hear them called that. So they give alarm calls, but they don't cooperatively defend territories. So the question is, why haven't woodchucks in this population and woodchucks in other populations moved further along this path to sociality, especially given that other marmots are more social? And to think about that, once again, we have to think about costs and benefits. So some of the factors that may influence sociality in some of the other ground-dwelling squirrels. So one of the big benefits to living in a group is because of anti-predator benefits. Living in a group means you can spot predators sooner. You may not be the one that gets taken just because of there's safety in numbers, and there's many anti-predator benefits that accrue to living in groups. And woodchuck's major predators include canids, particularly domestic dogs and foxes. Red-tailed hawks can take the juveniles. Adults are too big for raptors, for hawks to take at least. But Gilsland Farm is a wildlife sanctuary, and domestic dogs are prohibited from the site. And fox predation is variable each year. Sometimes there are foxes present. Route 1 takes its toll on foxes, unfortunately, because they need to roam over a bigger area. So that's why I said it varies a bit from year to year. So at this site, at least, woodchucks may not gain really significant anti-predator benefits by living in groups. Another reason to live in groups is because it gets you better access to resources. But again, for herbivorous animals, food's not usually considered limiting for those animals. You know, there's plenty of food around, even though woodchucks don't eat grasses, they eat what we call forbs, or the non-woody, non-grasses like dandelion and clover. Those things probably are not that limiting. So living in groups and jointly defending an area may not really secure them additional food resources. Another reason why other marmot species, the more social groups, live in groups, has to do with the environments that they live in, these harsh environments. So they're living in places that get a substantial snow cover, and the seasons are relatively short. Their active seasons are relatively short. And some of those species of marmots hibernate in family groups. When I told you about the marmots, the alpine marmots that are European, and you have the parents and their 3-year-old, 2-year-old, 1-year-old, and new juveniles, they all group together to hibernate, and they put the juveniles in the center because those are the most vulnerable to the cold, and everybody kind of huddles up. Group hibernation has never been documented for woodchucks, although I have some anecdotal evidence that they may hibernate with siblings or even with their moms. But also woodchucks live in some of the more moderate climates. They're not living in these really harsh alpine habitats like some of the other ones do. So again, they may not really get much benefit to hibernating in groups compared to the other ones. So maybe woodchucks aren't more social because they don't have better benefits or don't get greater benefits from living in groups. Alternatively, maybe the costs are too great for them. Okay? And one of the costs to living in a group is infanticide. Other species of rodents do commit infanticide. Prairie dogs do it. Alpine marmots, that group that I was mentioning before, will kill each other's offspring given an opportunity. It's a way to reduce competition around them. Again, this has not been documented in woodchucks, so we don't even know if it occurs. But there is something else that can accrue as a cost, and that's reproductive suppression, which I mentioned before. And this does occur in other marmots as well. And there's evidence in this population at Gilsland that there may be reproductive suppression going on. So there have been cases where a mom and her daughter will share substantial parts of their home range. But it's more likely that only one of those two females reproduces, and it's usually the mom. So one of the costs of staying home may be that you're being suppressed by your mother, okay, in terms of your reproduction. So you're competing for reproduction, and in order to stay home, you have to pay that cost. There have been cases where once the daughter shifts her home range a little bit, then she'll be able to pull off a litter. But it may be several years past when we normally would see them reproduce that she actually has her first litter. So what can woodchucks then tell us about social behavior? And what's surprising about them? Well, what we see is that even in a solitary species, kinship can influence the spatial patterns and interactions among animals. And maybe if the benefits of sociality don't outweigh the costs, that could be one of the reasons why we don't see these animals moving even further along the path to sociality. It's just not in their overall best interest to do that. And one of the other things to think about that's kind of interesting about woodchucks in general is how their habitat has changed over time and how those changes may have shaped their social organization. So here in my little cartoon, we go back thousands of years ago. If we came to the eastern part of North America where woodchucks occur, the world looked very different back then. It was much more forested, and woodchucks may have lived in isolated populations where there was good habitat for them, because they need to have open fields, but then they hibernate in the trees usually, where they're more protective from that. And so if they may have been constrained in their dispersal options because, again, there was not a lot of suitable habitat, and then they had to cross unsuitable habitat to get to it. So they may have lived near relatives, which would predispose them to interact with each other favorably and setting the stage for further social evolution. Today, however, I should say, the highly social marmots that we see, like the alpine marmots and some of the Vancouver Island or Olympic marmots, experience those conditions. They're living in high elevation, montane environments, and the habitat is patchy. Right? There's not a lot of good habitat, and so the animals are concentrated where the good habitat is. Well, then in the last 300 years or so, when Europeans moved in and chopped down the trees, we've actually probably increased the amount of habitat for woodchucks and allowed them to expand their ranges, perhaps spread out away from each other more, and actually become less tolerant of each other, and which would be the way that most people would describe these animals, as being asocial, solitary animals. But if you think about what's happening today, they're experiencing another round of habitat changes. Okay, we're now encroaching, human development is now encroaching on their habitat, and we may be forcing them back into small habitats, okay, that are separated from each other, that are patchy, that are dangerous to cross to get from one good patch to another patch. So they may once again be constrained in their dispersal options and may be settling their relatives. So we may be pushing them towards greater sociality. So it's kind of interesting to think about the fact that woodchucks may be facing a situation today that's quite similar to their ancestral condition that they faced a long time ago. So with that, I will say that even after watching these animals for so many years, they continue to surprise me. The population has changed quite a bit, and I keep going back because every year has been different out there, and keeps me wondering what I'm going to see next. It can be somewhat like a soap opera sometimes out there. But with that, I'd like to just end by thanking Maine Audubon for letting me do what I do for so many years out there, and essentially having free reign of the place and traipsing all over. I'd like to thank USM and the National Science Foundation for funding this project over the years. And last but not least, we could not have shown you all of these data without having the help of a small army of field assistants over the years, some of whom have put in hundreds of hours in the field with me, getting up very early in the morning to be up when the woodchucks wake up and hauling traps around and trying to recognize dye marks. So I thank them, and I thank you for your attention, and I would be happy to answer some questions. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen after you get a look at these cute little pups that were coming out. All right. There we go.
Hello, can you hear me okay? This is Carol from Portland. I've met you before, and longtime member of Maine Audubon. So how do you add genetic diversity then into the woodchuck population if they seem to be, not straying too far from home?
Mm-hmm.
Kind of thing.
Yes, that's a good question. So the animal is, Gilsland Farm is surrounded by other habitat, and there are woodchucks that live in the neighborhood. And every year we see new animals that come in that I've never seen before. It's like, okay, who's that? There's no ear tag on that animal. So new animals definitely do disperse in. I think sometimes they have a little help getting to the site, but yeah, so they will disperse. And males in particular are, during breeding season, males are on the move. They're prowling around looking for females. Not all males necessarily have a territory. So, and what's interesting too, our DNA work shows that females don't breed with just one male. They will have, so it could be multiple fathers within a single litter. So that all of that contributes to maintaining some genetic diversity in the population.
Do you mean that people have been have a heart trap groundhogs and miraculously dropped them off?
Correct. Not something I recommend, but we can revisit that later. Yes.
Wow. Okay. Thank you.
Sure.
Chris, I have a question in the chat, if I can pose that to you. So Neil Gallagher had said, can the results re-socializing found in the Gilsland Farm woodchucks be extended to less limited areas? You mentioned the unwelcoming environment outside the farm.
Yes, and so that's the interesting question. And there are very few people that have studied woodchucks, but we'd like to know sort of that was one of the questions that really was driving some of my earlier work, was to do more of the comparative aspects of this, to see if woodchucks in, like, for example, less dense populations are less social. And that's still a good question to ask. It's just that it has been it's been challenging to find another population as amenable to study as Gilsland has been. You run into problems with sample sizes and logistics and things like that. But so that's kind of the big question, and to see if animals that live in other areas that have maybe more habitat available to them are less social. That would be what we would expect.
Excellent. Okay, there's a couple more questions that came in. So what specifically do mother woodchucks do to suppress reproduction among their progeny?
Okay, so that's a good question. It's basically it's the aggressive interaction. So it's being chased, it's stress. Basically what happens when animals are stressed, you can suppress their hormones. Okay, we know this in humans. Okay, when human females are really stressed by things, they'll stop ovulating, for example. And so we see that in other animals as well, other mammals. Females, because of those constant sort of, it's low intensity aggressive interactions. It's being displaced from the food. It's being just moved out of the way. It's like, no, I want to sleep there, so you have to move. And just that level of interaction can be enough to prevent a female from cycling in her hormones and from ovulating. And so it's only when you kind of remove some of that pressure, you don't have all of those intense interactions, those aggressive interactions, that then the female's hormones can sort of kick into gear and she can start ovulating again. And so there's been a lot of studies done with primates and other social species that show that that kind of reproductive suppression can occur.
Excellent, thank you. How long do woodchucks live?
That's a good question. So, well, the vast majority of them don't live past their first, well, not vast majority. So half of them disappear their first year. So of all those pups that I've caught, half of them I don't see again after that first summer. Okay, so a lot of them don't make it past that first summer, and getting through your first hibernation, because you need to be fat enough to survive that first hibernation. You got to be in a good place to hibernate too. But once you kind of get through that first season, many of the animals in this population will live to be 5 or 6 years old. There have been a couple of record woodchucks. So some of the oldest, there have been 2 females. One of them was at least 12 when she died, when she disappeared, when she died. And then I've had another one that was one of her daughters was 10. One of her granddaughters was also, I think it was 10. And that was an interesting story. I can share that if we have time later on, because I could talk, I have stories, after 24 field seasons, I have stories. So it's been interesting. And the fact that these animals have tags allows me to tell what happens to them. So I can tell this one real quick. I got Maine Audubon got an email or phone call from a wildlife rehabilitator that had a black woodchuck, and it had been hit by a car over by Capisset Pond in that neighborhood, not at the pond itself, but in the neighborhood nearby. And so the people brought it to the wildlife rehabber. It was a black woodchuck, yes, and it was tagged. Unfortunately, it died, but I got the tag numbers from the rehabber, and that's how I knew who this animal was. And then she was 10 years old. And she had probably, just given where Gilsland is and where Capissic Pond is, for those of you who know Portland, I don't think that she dispersed that far on her own. Again, she may have had some help from somebody in the neighborhood who decided that Capissic Pond might have been a better place for her to live than under their shed or something. But yeah, it was just the fact that she had the tags that told us so much about what happened to her. Still a mystery as to really what did happen, but yeah. Okay, next question.
All right, this is one that, of course, my daughter, if she was on the call, would ask as well, but how much wood can they chuck?
So I tell people it costs you $1 to find that out, but there is an answer for those of you who don't. So when the question, of course, is how much wood would a woodchuck chuck if a woodchuck could chuck wood? The answer is a woodchuck would chuck all the wood it could chuck if a woodchuck could chuck wood.
Perfect. Let's see. Why don't you recommend live trapping and relocating woodchucks?
Okay, so I'm going to get on my soapbox here because this is it. A lot of people are doing it because they think it's the humane thing to do. And I get that, I really do, because I've had chipmunks digging under my patio at home, and it's like, oh, I don't want to kill you. But part of the problem is when you relocate an animal, they don't know where the burrows are. They don't know where the safe places are. You're moving it into a place that's like taking you and dumping you out in the middle of the woods someplace. You don't know where you are. And so what will happen is, so one of the things that can happen is they just start moving. And if there are other woodchucks there, woodchucks are territorial. So they're not going to let the newcomer stay. And so they're just going to keep chasing it out. And eventually it's going to come to a road. It might get hit by a car. It's going to come and encounter a dog or another predator, and it's going to die. And it's not the fate that you really wanted for that animal. It could also potentially spread disease to another population. Another reason is you're just kind of moving the problem to somebody else. And I'll tell a story, again, another story. This has not to do with Gilsland Farm, but it was at the Eastern Trail. And I was just out, my husband and I went to the Eastern Trail to go for a walk. And I saw somebody with a trap at the back of their car, and I knew what they were doing. But at that point, it was too late. They had just let the animal go. It was just in the big field right there by the parking lot. We went for a walk and came back, and an hour later, the woodchuck was out in the parking lot. This was one of those 90-degree days in the summer in Portland. Somebody's dog had found it because there was no burrows. There was no place for it to hide. And the dog had found it and injured it. And within an hour after it was released, it was dead because it had been injured by the dog and it was heat stressed. And so it was right in the middle of the parking lot. So I just moved it off to the side. And so then it's like, that's why I really ask people not to move them, because it's not humane. This animal probably didn't suffer, or probably did suffer and did not die all that quickly. So what do you do instead? That's the big question. What do you do instead? So fences. Okay, and there's different ways, and I'm happy to chat with people. I can always share my email address, or you can share my email address to people too. Fences, odor, scents. You can go to a farm supply store and buy bobcat scent or urine or coyote scent, and you can put that out. You'll have to reapply it because if it rains and over days it'll go away, it'll dissipate, but you can try to convince it that this is not a good place to live. You can harass it. Okay, you can just, every time you see it, you chase it. You can kind of make it somehow deter it from wanting to live there, making it think about benefits of staying versus costs of staying. And if you shift that cost benefit ratio, you may be able to encourage them to move someplace else. So those are some quick off the top of my head thoughts for other means, but really live trapping and relocation is not a particularly humane solution. Okay, off my soapbox.
Is there a maximum number of woodchucks that can live at Gilsland Farm, and how much territory does a woodchuck need? So
the population peaked probably about, oh gosh, now maybe 10 to 15 years ago. We had about 30 to 35 adults and yearlings living out there. So there was a substantial, and then I think the one year my students and I caught like 42 juveniles. that was a very busy field season. And then since then, the habitat has changed quite a bit out there. And so the habitat's actually not as conducive to them. The mowing regime has changed there. So the plant community is actually quite a bit different. So, so there aren't as many animals out there as there used to be. And it's actually hit the lowest point was last year. I had probably only half a dozen adults and yearlings that were out there. So it was a dramatic decline, in part because of the habitat, but also because of disease, probably some predation, things like that as well. So, but that was pretty, and that was probably what it was capped at. So a female, her territory might be about 3/4 of an acre. And then males are usually about twice that much on average.
How many woodchucks have you tracked in 24 years?
That's a good question. I was just looking at my ear tags, and I'm almost up to 600 ear tags, but I haven't caught that many of them because there's other ear tags that have gone missing. So, but I mean, you saw I had over close to 400 juveniles. So I'd probably say a couple hundred adults and yearlings too. I have to go back and look at that, but there've been quite a few.
What is the ratio of males to females that end up hit by vehicles?
Oh, that's a good question too. I'd say off the top of my head, there are more males because males are the ones that still tend to leave home. They're the ones dispersing, but there's still a fair number of females that get hit because they're just, even in Gilsland Farm itself, on the property, they run it back and forth across the road. Even if you're not driving fast, they'll just run out in front of the cars. And so the females, if their territory is on both sides of the road, they can get hit that way. But overall, I would say that it's still more males than females. But I'd have to look at the data to say the exact ratio.
Do other animals use their burrows or vice versa?
Definitely. So that's one of the ecological roles that woodchucks play, is they're the ones that are digging the holes. And what's really interesting is it seems to be the juveniles that make the new burrows. They're the ones that are kind of the explorers, the adventurers, and they'll dig a new burrow, and then if an adult likes it, then they'll widen it, make it a little bigger for themselves. But certainly mice use those burrows, chipmunks, I watched chipmunks run in and out of those burrows. Skunks can use those burrows. In other parts of the country, rabbits would use those. We don't have so many rabbits up here. And then foxes will take them over as well. Again, maybe expand them a little bit to use it, not at the same time, obviously. The rock foxes and woodchucks probably would not be using the same burrow, but foxes can, and foxes have used the woodchuck burrows that are at Gilsland as well. So yeah, so they're nice home builders for many other species.
Another one here. So do woodchucks truly hibernate?
Yes, they are. So the marmots are the largest of the true hibernators. And we've done some interesting work. I had a colleague at Penn State University who was a physiological ecologist, and he had been studying hibernation in his population in Pennsylvania. And so we actually did a really nice comparative study of woodchucks that lived in Maine, at Gilsland, in Pennsylvania, kind of near Philadelphia, that part of Pennsylvania, and also in South Carolina. We had a collaborator at Clemson University. And we put little tiny temperature data loggers inside these animals along with a radio transmitter. We surgically implanted them right in the abdomen. And that temperature data logger took a record every hour of their body temperature. And we were able to look at that profile over the whole course of a winter. And it was really neat because all animals in all three populations hibernated, and the overall pattern was similar. But as you might expect, the Clemson woodchucks hibernated. For one thing, we didn't know if animals down in south hibernated, and they did, but it was much shorter period of time, as you might imagine, than the Pennsylvania woodchucks, and the Pennsylvania woodchucks were shorter than the Maine woodchucks. So we were able to look at that a little bit more. But yeah, they definitely are hibernators. Their body temperatures drop down almost to freezing. They can't get too low though, because their bodies can't freeze. So once they get too low, they do have to sort of crank up their metabolism in order to keep themselves above about 4 degrees Celsius is about as low as they can go.
All right, this one's from Susan. What's the acreage of Gilsland? I'm familiar with the habitat here in Topsham for woodchucks, and have no idea how many may burrowed in. I do hear them whistle, however, it reminds us when the whistling happens.
Yeah, so, and that's a good question. It's been a long time since I looked at that. I don't think I have those numbers here. I'm pretty sure Gilsland Farm, I want to say, is about 60 hectares, but I'd have to go back and look at that. I think they might have it on their on Maine Audubon's website, so I can't remember off the top of my head, but I want to say 60 hectares. So no, it's not that big. So the biggest meadow, North Meadow, is 6 hectares. Tell you that one. And then the Pond Meadow and the West Meadow are 3 to 4 hectares. I'm used to thinking in terms of metric, and I don't remember. A hectare is about 2.5 acres, I think. So maybe it's 60 acres, between 60 and 70 acres. Sorry, I can't remember off the top of my head.
I looked it up. It's 65
Acres?
acres. Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Trustee Sloan.
Yes, excellent.
Thank you. One question here from Jacqueline Cressy. We host a family of woodchucks in a bouldery retaining wall behind our house. This summer, we watched a pair of male pups play and tussle together for at least 15 minutes, pulling each other's tails and knocking each other over. Is this typical behavior?
Definitely, yes. That's one of the fun things to watch, yes. Juveniles, like so many other juvenile animals, are playful. As they get older, that tapers off. They're on to more important things like eating. But yeah, play is definitely part of their repertoire. Even yearlings. I've watched yearlings, so they haven't dispersed yet. I've watched yearlings playing with each other as well. This past spring, there was a male and a brother and a sister, and then I don't know the sex of the third one because I didn't catch them. But I called them the Three Musketeers because they were all hanging out together at the same burrow, and they'd play. And this was when they were a year old, and then they went their separate ways.
Well, that is all the questions we have in the chat right now. If anyone else has a question and they want to just unmute themselves and ask, we will give you a few minutes here.
I have a question, Jenny. Chris, I'm curious what a woodchuck that is feeding, what their path looks like. And I'm asking partly because I have a big backfield that has tall grass in it near me. And I can sometimes see what I'm guessing is a woodchuck's path. I don't know that for sure. And I'm curious, do they just sort of go from dandelion to dandelion, or do they like head for a favorite spot? And I'm asking partly because a really fun thing that we suggest to parents, at least in the winter, is it can be sort of fun when there are animal tracks in the snow, to sort of follow them for a while and see where they go and what they do. And I'm wondering if you're obviously seeing it through scopes, but for me, who doesn't have a scope and isn't sitting around looking at my field, the next best thing is sort of following that, those paths, which actually I haven't done. But I'm just curious what what they look like when they're just sort of wandering around. Are they feeding, going from one food source to another, or is there other stuff going on?
Well, because they have a burrow, they will be moving from that burrow and going out. So there are definitely trails that you can see going through the vegetation leading to their burrows. That's one of the ways I can find a burrow before the grass gets too tall, is to follow those paths. Sometimes it's kind of hard to tell, is it the turkeys that made that path? Because Gilsland also has a lot of turkeys now. So, it's just going to be you can tell that something has moved through the grass. But so they will have kind of paths that they take back and forth to kind of get out to a trail, because they like to feed on the trails on the mowed area, because that's the nice tender stuff that's been that it's kept short and keeps growing. So that's they really like eating that stuff. But so yeah, so there will be some of that. But then once they kind of get to a place where they're feeding, they will move around within that. And so you wouldn't be able to tell necessarily unless you could see like that it's sort of matted down a little bit, especially like if it's in a mowed area, you can tell that many times. But yeah, they definitely will have trails during the summer through the grass that you can tell. And sometimes you can follow them back to a burrow and locate that burrow. That's one of the reasons why logistically it is challenging to study these animals, is because the grass does get so tall. There's a reason why people don't study woodchucks and they study yellow-bellied marmots that live in the Rockies and, you know, Vancouver Island. It's a whole lot easier to see them because the grass is like yay high and there's rocks, and plus you're sitting in the mountains as opposed to sitting in a field in New England. You know, there's just that panache too. But yeah, so you can use that. And then what's cool is in the winter time. So, you know, these animals are coming out in February. There's still snow on the ground. They're not eating yet. So they're probably still relying very heavily on that fat to get them through. They're not using perhaps as much fat over hibernation, because that's the whole point of hibernating, is to save energy. But when they first come up in the spring, there's nothing to eat yet. And so they have to kind of wait for the snow to go away. They're not storing food underground like chipmunks do. So they're still living off of their fat very early on. And so, but you can follow their tracks through the snow at that time of the year. And it's kind of nice when there is snow on the ground, because it's very obvious that a woodchuck has emerged from a burrow, because there's this hole in the snow, and a lot of times there'll be dirt on the snow that they have brought up too from below ground. And what's really cool too is that the males they know where those burrows are, even though they're covered in snow. You can follow their tracks, and that burrow's covered in snow, but the tracks lead right up to it. It's like they still have that spatial sense, that spatial memory of where it's, because they're looking for females. So they're moving around looking for females. So that's kind of a cool aspect too.
Can I ask one quick follow-on? What does their scat look like?
It looks kind of like, it doesn't look like deer. It's more like skunk, but just more, well, sometimes there's more grass in it, but kind of long and cylindrical, but it's not pellets. Definitely not pellets. And it's pretty, it would be unusual to find their scat. So in their burrows, are not really extensive like a prairie dog's burrow or something like that, but they've got to go down, especially for their hibernation, their hibernacular places where they hibernate. They got to go down below frost line, so they'll be down about 1 meter deep, and then they can extend out maybe up to 15 meters. So 15 yards or so, a little bit more than that, 20 yards. Burrows may all be connected to each other within that. So, and then underground there, they've got tunnels that go through it, and then they'll have sleeping chambers in there. And one of the things you might see them do is gathering dry leaves or dry grass, and they line those sleeping burrows with dry material for bedding. But one of the chambers underground is a latrine chamber. So they have a little latrine underground. But the other thing is sometimes they will poop above ground too, but it's like cats. They dig a little hole and then they'll bury it right outside of their burrows. But they don't usually do that. I mean, but you won't just find scat around like you do fox and skunk and things like that. So they're kind of like cats in that regard. Any other questions?
I was looking for other questions. There's nothing else in the chat right now. If anyone else has another question, feel free to unmute yourself.
There is sorry, I'm seeing a couple of questions that came to me. One is, as far as social aspect, have you found males or females to be more social?
Females, yeah. Females are certainly the ones that are interacting more with each other and with their offspring. Males Males are primarily interacting with females during the breeding season. And then, I mean, there will be times when males also are, will interact with females. But usually it's females interacting with their offspring or related offspring. You can always tell if you see two, not always, but many times if you see two woodchucks that are tolerant of each other, it's often going to be a male and a female. Males will definitely tolerate the female. Females may not be so tolerant of the males. They're about the same size, so a female can chase off a male if she really is motivated to do so. Unless they're mom and offspring, you know, sometimes with that you can tell pretty closely. So behaviorally, you can sometimes tell the males from the females. You can't tell them apart just by looking at them, though. So.
And another question is, does inbreeding happen often, as well as having males from other areas coming into the farm?
There probably is some inbreeding that occurs. I have certainly seen sons courting their mothers. And I've seen cases where there are probably cousins that bred, or uncle or aunts and nephews. Many animals can actually tolerate some amount of inbreeding. If enough inbreeding goes on, you kind of wipe out the bad alleles, the bad genes after a little while. So they could probably handle some amount of inbreeding in this population without too much ill effect. Now, just because I've seen courtship, though, doesn't mean that there's actually mating that has occurred, because mating usually occurs underground, so we don't know for sure. That's why the DNA comes in handy. And I saw a question pop up about if I come to schools and talk, and yes, I'm happy. Like I said, the props are often a big hit, and I work at Maine Audubon, and if you know, they have lots of programming in the summertime and stuff. So I've talked to everywhere. The most challenging audience were the 2-year-olds. It's really hard to hold their attention. You can point in the burrows. It was more talking to the parents and the caregivers there. So yeah, I'm more than happy to come out. And I was gonna pop my chat up here, and I know there's not too many people left, but oops. I'm gonna throw, and you are welcome to share my email address with other people, but there's my email address if people do want to contact me directly. Yes, and thank you for the recording. Yeah.
Great.
All
Well,
right.
thank you so much, Chris. And I have to say, I'm so delighted to know that you have created a population of both what is it, hair dyed and not tattooed, what's the word, pierced and hair dyed woodchucks at Gilsland Farm. I think I feel like I got to go out and check them out.
Yes, I know. So now it's like, well, that's the tricky part. It's like, okay, is that animal dye marked? You can often see that ear tags, but the dye mark can be challenging for sure. But yeah, some people, yeah, and the black ones are kind of cool because a lot of people don't realize that those are actually woodchucks. They think they're something else. So
Yeah, I've never seen that.
yeah.
Well, thank you so much. There's all sorts of kudos and expressions of thanks in the chat box, Chris. So thanks so much for sharing your research with us and your observations. And I certainly understand woodchucks quite a bit better now. So it's great to learn more about our woodchuck friends.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure. As you can tell, I always love talking about this work and letting people know something about this somewhat maligned animal for sure. So my pleasure.
Yeah. Great. All right. Well, everyone have a great evening and have a great Thanksgiving in whatever way you are celebrating it. So
Thanks everyone.
Thank you, Chris. Have a nice night.
Thank you.